Blind storage unit buyers, what's the most interesting thing you found? I started buying abandoned storage units 3 years ago when my divorce left me broke and desperate. The idea was simple: bid low, hope for treasure, sell whatever I found online. Most units contained garbage, moldy furniture, broken appliances, boxes of worthless junk. But occasionally, you'd hit gold. The auction was on a Tuesday morning in Riverside. About 20 regulars showed up, plus a few newcomers who'd watched too many reality shows. Unit 47B looked promising from the outside. Newer padlock, no rust stains, organized stacks visible in the dim light. Been abandoned for 6 months, the auctioneer announced. Renter stopped paying after missing 3 consecutive months. Standard rules apply. You buy it, you clean it out within 48 hours. Bidding started at $50. An older woman named Dolores, who'd been doing this for decades, raised it to $75. I went to $100. She studied me, then nodded and stepped back. For $125, Unit 47B was mine. The first hour was standard cleanup. Boxes of winter clothes, a decent mountain bike, some electronics that might fetch $30 on eBay. Nothing exciting. I was starting to think I'd overpaid when I found the filing cabinet. It was locked, sitting behind a dresser like someone had tried to hide it. The lock was expensive, not the cheap kind you'd put on personal documents. I managed to pick it with a paperclip, a skill I'd learned during my misspent youth. Inside were 3 manila folders in a small metal box. The first folder contained property deeds for houses I'd never heard of. The second held bank statements showing deposits of exactly $3,000 every month for 2 years. No employer listed, no source indicated, just regular deposits totaling over $70,000. The third folder made my stomach drop. Photographs, dozens of them, all taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Different people, different locations, but all showing the same thing. People going about their daily lives, completely unaware they were being watched. A woman leaving a yoga studio, a man walking his dog, children playing in a backyard. Each photo was labeled with a date and location, written in neat handwriting. The metal box contained a key and a business card for something called Riverside Investigations. No address, just a phone number. That's when I heard footsteps outside the unit. I looked up to see a tall man in the expensive suit watching me from the doorway. He wasn't another bidder. I would have remembered him. His eyes immediately locked onto the open filing cabinet. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, his voice too casual. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I quickly closed the folders and stood up. "Just old paperwork," I lied. "Nothing valuable." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's good to hear. Sometimes people leave behind things that don't belong to them, things that could cause problems for whoever finds them." The way he emphasized problems made it clear this wasn't a friendly warning. "I should get back to work," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly and walked away, but I could feel him watching from somewhere nearby. I shoved the folders and metal box into my backpack, loaded my truck as quickly as possible, and got out of there. At home, I spread the contents across my kitchen table and really studied them. The photographs weren't random. They followed patterns. Same people, different days, tracking routines and schedules. The dates spanned 8 months, ending abruptly 3 weeks ago. When I flipped one photo over, I found something that made my blood run cold. Written in red ink: "Target confirmed. Payment pending. Permanent solution authorized." I sat staring at those words for 10 minutes, my hands shaking. This wasn't just surveillance. This was a hit list. Let me back up and explain how I got here, because 3 years ago, I was living a completely different life. I was married to my high school sweetheart, Amanda, working as a project manager for a construction company, living in a 3-bedroom house with a white picket fence, the American dream, right down to the golden retriever named Chester. Then Amanda decided she needed to find herself with her yoga instructor, Brendan. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, along with demands for half of everything we owned. By the time the lawyers finished picking our life apart, I was left with my truck, a maxed-out credit card, and a studio apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's cats. My construction job disappeared during the recession. At 42, I was competing with kids half my age for entry-level positions that paid barely enough to cover rent. That's when my neighbor Pete told me about storage unit auctions. "It's like gambling, but legal," he explained over beers at the dive bar down the street. "Sometimes you lose $50 on a unit full of Christmas decorations from 1987. Sometimes you find a Rolex in a shoebox." Pete had been doing it for 5 years. He showed me photos on his phone, antique furniture he'd sold for thousands, vintage guitars, jewelry, electronics. But he also showed me the failures: moldy clothes, broken appliances, boxes of tax returns from people who'd moved to Florida. "The key," he said, "is learning to read the signs. Clean units usually have better stuff. If you see moving boxes, that's good. If you see garbage bags, run away." My first auction was a disaster. I bid $60 on a unit that contained nothing but old magazines and a broken exercise bike. The magazines were water damaged, and the bike was missing half its parts. I lost money on the truck rental alone, but my second unit changed everything. For $85, I bought a 10x10 space that contained a vintage motorcycle in perfect condition. I sold it for $1,200. Suddenly, I understood the addiction. Over the next 2 years, I developed a system. I drive to auctions within a 100-mile radius, always carrying cash and basic tools. I learned to spot the difference between organized abandonment and desperate flight. When people plan to leave, they take the good stuff. When they flee suddenly, they leave everything behind. I found wedding rings hidden in coffee cans, cash rolled up inside poster tubes, expensive tools wrapped in old blankets. Most of my finds were mundane: books, furniture, household items that sold for a few dollars each. But those occasional big scores kept me going. The storage unit business taught me things about people that I'd never considered. Everyone has secrets. Everyone has possessions they can't bear to throw away, but can't afford to keep. Storage units are like archaeological sites, preserving moments when people's lives fell apart. I found love letters from the 1940s, family photos spanning decades, children's artwork carefully preserved in plastic bins. I started keeping the personal items separate, posting them on Craigslist for free with descriptions like, "Family photos found in storage unit. Contact me if these are yours." Sometimes people would respond, grateful to recover memories they thought were lost forever. But Unit 47B was different from the moment I saw it. The woman from the yoga studio. Her photos showed her routine: leaving work at 5:30, yoga class at 6:15, home by 8 U. Someone had been planning something terrible for her. I grabbed my laptop and started researching. Riverside Investigations didn't exist, at least not officially. The phone number traced to a burner cell that had been deactivated, but the properties on those deeds were real, all owned by a shell company called Meridian Holdings. 3 hours of internet searching led me down a rabbit hole that made me wish I'd never opened that filing cabinet. The first property was a small apartment building on Elm Street. According to public records, Meridian had been trying to buy it for 2 years. The tenants had organized and refused all offers, claiming the company was trying to force them out with harassment and intimidation. The second property was a house owned by an elderly couple named the Washingtons. They'd lived there for 40 years, raising 5 children and hosting family reunions in the backyard. Meridian wanted to demolish it for a luxury condo development. Each property told the same story: long-term residents fighting against a corporation that wanted their land for development projects that would price out everyone who currently lived there. But this wasn't just about real estate. As I dug deeper into Meridian Holdings, I discovered a pattern of acquisitions that stretched back 5 years. They'd buy properties in working-class neighborhoods, evict the residents, and build high-end developments. The displaced families had nowhere to go. Riverside's affordable housing had been disappearing for years. Meridian Holdings was linked to a dozen other companies, all connected to real estate development, but not the kind that build shopping malls. They specialized in acquiring properties for urban renewal projects, which meant buying out residents who didn't want to sell and demolishing their homes for luxury developments. The people in the photographs all lived in buildings that Meridian wanted to buy, buildings where residents had organized and refused their buyout offers. I found news articles about suspicious deaths and disappearances in other cities where Meridian had projects. A tenant organizer in Phoenix who died in a car accident the day before a city council vote. A family in Denver whose house burned down after they refused to sell. An attorney in Portland who disappeared while investigating Meridian's business practices. The pattern was clear, but proving it would be impossible. These weren't accidents or coincidences. They were systematic elimination of obstacles to Meridian's development plans. My phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello? You have something that belongs to me," the voice said. I recognized it immediately. The man from the storage unit. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't be stupid. I saw what you found. Those documents are evidence in an ongoing investigation. You're interfering with police business. If you're a cop, then show me a badge and a warrant." Silence. Then, "Meet me at Riverside Park, by the duck pond in 1 hour. Bring everything you took from that unit." "This doesn't have to get complicated." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, adrenaline flooding my system. This man wasn't a police officer. Police officers don't threaten people or arrange secret meetings in parks. They show up at your door with warrants and backup. I had 2 choices: meet him and probably disappear forever, or run. But if I ran, what about the people in those photographs? Were they still in danger? The smart thing would have been to pack my truck and drive as far from Riverside as possible. Change my name, start over somewhere else, pretend I'd never opened that filing cabinet. But every time I looked at those photographs, I saw faces of people who had no idea their lives were in danger. The woman leaving the yoga studio was probably at work right now, planning her evening routine, unaware that someone had been documenting her movements and planning her murder. The man walking his dog was probably retired, thinking his biggest worry was whether his arthritis would flare up during his morning walk. I called the police instead. "Riverside Police Department, I need to report a possible murder conspiracy. I'll transfer you to Detective Reese." 2 minutes later. "This is Detective Reese. What's the nature of your complaint?" I explained everything. The storage unit, the photographs, the man in the suit. I offered to bring in the evidence immediately. "That's interesting," Detective Reese said. His tone shifted from routine to alert. "Can you describe this man who approached you?" "Tall, expensive suit, dark hair, probably mid-40s. He said the documents were evidence in a police investigation." "What did you say his name was?" "He didn't give one." Long pause. I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come down to the station right away and bring everything you found. Don't meet this man at the park. Don't go anywhere alone. Do you understand?" "Yes, but this is extremely important. How soon can you get here?" 20 minutes? Make it 15. And if anyone approaches you or follows you, call 911 immediately." I loaded everything into my backpack and drove to the police station, checking my mirrors every few seconds. Twice I thought I saw the same black sedan behind me, but it turned off before I could be sure. The Riverside Police Department was a concrete building that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and never updated. Detective Reese met me at the front desk, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. "I'm Detective Reese," she said, shaking my hand. "Thanks for coming in. Let's go somewhere we can talk privately." She led me to an interrogation room with fluorescent lights and a metal table bolted to the floor. Another detective joined us, a younger man named Torres, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Before we start," Detective Reese said, "I need to know exactly how you came across these materials. Don't leave anything out." I told them everything, starting with the auction and ending with the phone call. They took notes and asked detailed questions about timing, the man's appearance, and exactly what he'd said. When I finished, Detective Reese examined each item carefully, while Torres took photographs of everything. "How familiar are you with Thomas Crenshaw?" Reese asked. "Never heard of him. He was a private investigator who specialized in corporate surveillance. 3 weeks ago, he disappeared. His office was cleaned out, his apartment emptied. We've been looking for him ever since." She pulled out a photo from a file folder. It showed a man in his 50s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like someone who spent too much time behind a desk and not enough time sleeping. "You think he's the one who rented the storage unit?" "I think he rented it because he was planning to disappear. The question is whether he did it voluntarily or someone made him disappear." Torres spoke up. "These photographs match surveillance reports from 2 other cases we're working. People who've been harassed by developers trying to force them out of their homes." Detective Reese pulled out more files. "Patricia Chen, the woman from the yoga studio. She's been receiving threatening phone calls for months. Someone would call at all hours, describing her daily routine in detail, telling her she should move away for her own safety." She opened another file. "Robert Wilson, the man with the dog. His house was broken into 3 times in 2 months. Nothing was stolen, but the intruder left messages spray-painted on his walls. 'Sell now or else.' And the man who approached you," Reese continued, "matches the description of Vincent Carver, Meridian Holdings head of security. He's ex-military, specializes in making problems go away." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that organize tenant unions and refuse to sell their properties." Torres spread out a map of Riverside with red pins marking locations. "Every person in these photographs lives in a building that Meridian wants to acquire. They've all refused buyout offers and they've all been experiencing escalating harassment." "So these people are in real danger?" 3 of them have disappeared in the past month," Detective Reese said grimly. "Margaret Foster, an 83-year-old woman who lived alone in a house Meridian wanted for a parking lot. Joseph Martinez, a teacher who organized a tenant union in his apartment building, and David Kim, a social worker who was helping residents fight illegal eviction notices." She pulled out missing person reports. Margaret Foster had last been seen leaving her house to walk to the grocery store. Joseph Martinez disappeared from his job. His car was found in the school parking lot, keys still in the ignition. David Kim vanished from his apartment, his door was unlocked, and his cat was found starving 3 days later. "We've been trying to build a case against Meridian, but we never had evidence. Corporate harassment is hard to prove, especially when the victims are too scared to testify. Until now." Detective Reese closed the files and looked at me seriously. "We're going to put you in protective custody while we process this evidence. Carver knows you have this information, which makes you a target. For how long? Until we can arrest everyone involved." That afternoon, they moved me to a safe house on the other side of town, a nondescript duplex in a residential neighborhood where unmarked police cars could blend in with normal traffic. 2 officers took shifts watching the house while I tried to process what I'd stumbled into. Detective Torres brought me Chinese food and stayed to explain what they'd learned from the evidence. "We ran the fingerprints from the filing cabinet," he said. "Confirmed it belonged to Thomas Crenshaw. But here's what's interesting. His prints were on some of the photographs, but not all of them. Someone else was involved in this surveillance operation. Vincent Carver? That's what we're thinking. Crenshaw was hired to conduct surveillance, but he didn't know what it was really for. When he figured out that Meridian was planning to kill these people, he tried to go to the police." Torres showed me a timeline they'd constructed. 3 weeks ago, Crenshaw contacted our department, said he had information about corruption in the city planning office. He was supposed to meet with Detective Reese, but he never showed up. That's when his office and apartment were cleaned out. "And you think Carver killed him?" "We think Carver discovered that Crenshaw was planning to expose the operation, so he eliminated Crenshaw and tried to recover all the evidence. But Crenshaw was smart. He hid the most damning materials in that storage unit. I spent that night in the safe house, unable to sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. Cars driving by, dogs barking, the wind rattling windows. I kept thinking about Thomas Crenshaw, a man I'd never met who had died trying to protect strangers." The next morning, Detective Reese called with an update. "We raided Meridian Holdings last night. Found a whole operation, fake investigations, intimidation campaigns, and worse. Vincent Carver was arrested at his home with enough evidence to put him away for life." "What did you find?" "Financial records showing payments to at least a dozen people for security services, detailed surveillance reports on every person who's opposed their development projects, and communications with city officials who've been taking bribes to approve their permits." She paused. "We also found Thomas Crenshaw's phone and wallet in Carver's desk drawer." "What about Thomas Crenshaw?" "Still missing, but we found blood in Carver's car. I think Crenshaw discovered what Meridian was really doing and tried to expose them. They killed him for it. And the people in the photographs? Safe. We've got them all in protective custody until the trial." Over the next few days, the scope of Meridian's operation became clear. They hadn't just been targeting individual property owners, they'd been systematically corrupting the entire development approval process in Riverside. City council members had been receiving cash payments to vote for Meridian projects. Building inspectors had been paid to ignore safety violations. Police officers had been bribed to ignore harassment complaints from residents fighting eviction. The operation had been running for 5 years, generating hundreds of millions in profits while displacing thousands of families from their homes. But the most disturbing discovery came when detectives searched Vincent Carver's personal property. In his home office, they found detailed psychological profiles of every person Meridian was targeting. He'd been studying their routines, their relationships, their vulnerabilities, planning exactly how to eliminate them if they couldn't be bought or intimidated. Detective Torres showed me some of the profiles during one of his visits to the safe house. "Look at this," he said, spreading out documents on the kitchen table. Carver had backup plans for backup plans. If intimidation didn't work, he'd arrange accidents. If accidents seemed suspicious, he'd stage robberies. If robberies failed, he had contacts who could make people disappear permanently. The profile for Patricia Chen, the woman from the yoga studio, was particularly detailed. Carver had documented her work schedule, her fitness routine, her grocery shopping habits, even the route she took to visit her elderly mother on Sundays. He'd identified 3 different ways to kill her and make it look accidental. "She walks the same route to yoga every day," I read from his notes. "No security cameras on the last 2 blocks. Vehicle accident would be most efficient. Side impact at the intersection of Oak and 3rd Street during evening rush hour. High probability of fatal injuries. Low probability of witness testimony." I felt sick reading it. This wasn't just corporate greed, it was premeditated murder planned with military precision. How many people were on his list? 47 in Riverside. But we found similar files for other cities where Meridian has projects. Phoenix, Denver, Portland, Seattle. We're talking about hundreds of potential victims. The FBI joined the investigation when they realized the scope of the conspiracy. Meridian Holdings had operations in 12 states, all following the same pattern. Identify properties they wanted, target residents who wouldn't sell, and eliminate obstacles through intimidation, corruption, or murder. Special Agent Rebecca Morrison interviewed me at the safe house. She was a tall woman with short blonde hair and the kind of intense focus that made you feel like she could see through walls. "This is the break we've been waiting for," she told me. "We've been tracking Meridian for 2 years, but they were careful. They used shell companies, cash payments, and contractors who couldn't be traced back to them. Your evidence gives us everything we need to take down the entire network." The trial took 8 months. I testified about finding the evidence, and the photographs became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Vincent Carver was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, wire fraud, and a dozen other charges. He got life without parole. But the most satisfying moment came when they arrested Meridian's CEO, a man named Douglas Whitman, who lived in a mansion in Malibu and had never set foot in any of the neighborhoods his company was destroying. Whitman tried to claim he knew nothing about Carver's methods. His lawyers argued that he was a legitimate businessman who'd been betrayed by a rogue employee. But the financial records told a different story. Whitman had personally approved the payments for security services and had been briefed on Carver's activities through encrypted emails. During his testimony, Whitman maintained that he'd never ordered anyone to be killed. When the prosecutor showed him the psychological profiles found in Carver's office, he insisted he'd never seen them before. "Mr. Whitman," the prosecutor said, "these profiles contain information that could only have come from your company's marketing research department. Are you saying you didn't know that your marketing team was providing surveillance data to your head of security?" "I don't micromanage my employees," Whitman replied. "But you do approve budgets, correct? You signed off on $2.3 million in payments to Vincent Carver over 3 years. What did you think that money was for?" "Security consulting." "What kind of security consulting requires detailed psychological profiles of individual property owners?" Whitman's lawyers objected, but the damage was done. The jury convicted him on all counts. Most of the other Meridian executives plea bargained down to lesser charges and served a few years in minimum security prison. They testified against Whitman in exchange for reduced sentences, providing detailed accounts of how the conspiracy operated. Thomas Crenshaw's body was never found, but the evidence of his murder was overwhelming. Carver had been careful about disposal, too careful for the body to be recovered. But his computer contained enough details about the killing to convince the jury that Crenshaw had been tortured before he died, probably to reveal where he'd hidden the evidence. The key from the metal box led to a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Inside, investigators found additional surveillance photos, financial records, and a detailed confession that Crenshaw had written before his death. In the confession, he explained how he'd been hired by Meridian to conduct standard background checks on property owners who were causing problems for their development projects. He thought he was helping a legitimate company deal with difficult tenants. "I realized something was wrong when they asked me to document daily routines and identify vulnerabilities," he wrote. "When I saw the first accident, a woman who fell down her apartment stairs the day after I submitted my report, I knew I had to go to the police. But Crenshaw had made a fatal mistake. He'd confronted Carver directly, demanding to know what was really happening to the people he'd been investigating. Carver had pretended to be shocked and promised to look into it. Instead, he'd immediately begun planning Crenshaw's elimination. "I'm writing this because I don't think I'm going to survive much longer," the confession concluded. "If something happens to me, please know that I never intended for anyone to be hurt. I was trying to do the right thing, but I waited too long. Don't make the same mistake I did. Reading that confession was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Thomas Crenshaw had died because he'd tried to save strangers, and his sacrifice had ultimately saved dozens of lives. The woman from the yoga studio was named Patricia Chen. She sent me a card after the trial thanking me for saving her life. She didn't know she was in danger, but the surveillance photos showed someone had been planning to make her disappear the same way Thomas Crenshaw had disappeared. "I can't imagine what would have happened if you hadn't found those photographs," she wrote. "My daughter starts college this fall. Because of you, I'll be there to see her graduate." I kept that card on my refrigerator for months. Robert Wilson, the man with the dog, invited me to a barbecue at his house. He'd organized a block party to celebrate the fact that their neighborhood would remain intact. Meridian's development plans had been permanently canceled as part of the criminal investigation. "You gave us our lives back," he told me, grilling burgers in the backyard where his children played. "We thought we were fighting a corporation. We had no idea we were fighting for our lives." The other residents who'd been targeted by Meridian had similar stories. They'd organized tenant unions, filed lawsuits, attended city council meetings, believing they were engaged in normal civic disputes. None of them knew that Vincent Carver was documenting their every move and planning their deaths. After the trial, I tried to go back to buying storage units, but it felt different. The thrill was gone. Every unit I opened reminded me of Thomas Crenshaw's storage space and the terrible secrets I'd found there. I stopped buying storage units after that. The idea of finding someone's abandoned belongings and selling them for profit felt wrong somehow. Instead, I used the reward money from the case to start a nonprofit that helps people fight against predatory developers. We called it the Thomas Crenshaw Foundation. Our mission is to provide legal assistance and investigative support to residents fighting illegal eviction and harassment by development companies. In our first year, we helped 17 families keep their homes. We documented harassment campaigns, connected residents with pro bono lawyers, and lobbied for stronger tenant protection laws. But our most important work involves investigating suspicious accidents and disappearances in communities targeted by aggressive developers. We've learned to recognize the patterns that Thomas Crenshaw identified too late, the escalation from buyout offers to intimidation to violence. Our second case came 6 months after Meridian's conviction. A family in Oakland was fighting eviction from a rent-controlled apartment building that a developer wanted to convert to luxury condos. The patriarch, a 67-year-old man named Eduardo Fernandez, had organized the tenants and hired a lawyer to challenge the eviction notices. Eduardo's daughter called us after her father was hit by a car while crossing the street. The driver fled the scene, and police were treating it as a hit and run. But the timing was suspicious. Eduardo was scheduled to testify at a city council hearing the next day about illegal harassment by the building's new owners. We sent an investigator to Oakland who discovered that Eduardo had been receiving threatening phone calls for weeks. Someone had been documenting his daily routine and following him to work. Security cameras from a nearby business captured footage of a black sedan that had been circling the block for 30 minutes before the accident. The license plate traced back to a security company owned by former Meridian employees who had avoided prosecution by cooperating with federal investigators. They were using the same playbook in Oakland that they'd perfected in Riverside. This time, we were ready for them. Working with Oakland police and federal prosecutors, we gathered evidence of the harassment campaign before they could eliminate all the witnesses. 3 people were arrested before they could hurt anyone else. Eduardo survived his injuries, testified at the city council hearing, and helped save his building from conversion. That success led to more referrals. Community organizers from around the country began contacting us when they suspected that accidents and disappearances in their neighborhoods were connected to development pressure. We've now investigated similar cases in 15 cities. The pattern is always the same. Aggressive developers identify communities they want to displace, residents organize to fight back, and suddenly people start having accidents. The Thomas Crenshaw Foundation has prevented at least 30 murders and documented corruption in 6 police departments. We've recovered millions in stolen deposits and prevented the displacement of thousands of families. But the work is dangerous. We've all received death threats, and 2 of our investigators have been attacked. I carry a gun now and vary my daily routine constantly. Last month, I hired a bodyguard after someone tried to run me off the road while I was driving to a meeting with federal prosecutors in San Francisco. The car, a black sedan with tinted windows, had been following me for 50 miles before it swerved into my lane and tried to force me into oncoming traffic. I managed to avoid the collision, but the message was clear. Some people really don't want us investigating their business practices. Despite the risks, I've never regretted opening that filing cabinet in Storage Unit 47B. Every family we've helped, every life we've saved, traces back to that moment when I decided to pick the lock instead of walking away. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Vincent Carver had been there when I opened that filing cabinet. Would I have become another missing person? Another unsolved case? But then I remember Patricia's card, and the 17 families who still have their homes, and Eduardo's grandchildren playing in the apartment building that's still their home. And I know that sometimes finding the right thing at the right time can change everything. The foundation has grown from just me working out of my apartment to a staff of 12 investigators, lawyers, and community organizers. We have offices in 5 cities and a budget of $2.3 million annually. Our success has attracted attention from legitimate development companies who want to distance themselves from the predatory practices we've exposed. Several major firms now hire us to review their community engagement processes and ensure they're not inadvertently supporting harassment campaigns. We've also partnered with journalism schools to train reporters how to investigate suspicious patterns of accidents and disappearances in communities facing development pressure. 3 investigative series produced by our journalism fellows have led to federal indictments. But our most important achievement is the database we've created, documenting the tactics used by predatory developers. We've identified 17 different strategies, from basic intimidation to sophisticated psychological warfare to outright violence. The database has become a resource for community organizers nationwide. When residents start experiencing harassment, they can compare their situation to our documented cases and identify the warning signs of escalation. We've learned that communities under attack often experience a predictable sequence of events. First comes the honeymoon phase, when developers make generous buyout offers and promise that relocation will be voluntary. When residents refuse to sell, the offers become less generous and more frequent. Developers claim they're trying to help people find better housing in safer neighborhoods. Next comes the documentation phase, when developers hire companies like Thomas Crenshaw's to conduct background checks and community assessments. Residents start noticing strangers taking photos and asking questions about their daily routines. The intimidation phase begins with anonymous phone calls, threatening letters, and minor vandalism. Residents are told they're fighting forces beyond their control and should take whatever money they can get before it's too late. If intimidation fails, developers escalate to more serious harassment. Break-ins, property damage, and staged incidents designed to make residents feel unsafe. The final phase involves violence disguised as accidents. Key organizers are targeted for elimination, usually through car accidents, falls, or other incidents that can be explained as bad luck. By documenting this pattern, we've helped communities recognize when they're being targeted and seek help before the situation turns violent. Our work has also led to changes in federal law. The Violence Against Communities Act, passed last year, makes it a federal crime to use violence or threats of violence to force people from their homes for commercial development. The law carries penalties of up to 20 years in prison and includes provisions for federal investigation of suspicious patterns of accidents and disappearances in communities facing development pressure. But legislation is only as effective as its enforcement, and we've learned that many police departments are either incompetent or corrupt when it comes to investigating developer violence. That's why we've started training our own investigators. Our team includes former FBI agents, retired police detectives, and forensic specialists who know how to gather evidence that will hold up in federal court. We've also developed relationships with honest cops in major cities who alert us when they encounter cases that match our patterns. Detective Reese, who handled the original Meridian investigation, now serves on our advisory board and helps train other officers to recognize developer violence. 6 months ago, she called me about a new case in Riverside. "We've got another storage unit situation," she said. "Different developer, same playbook." The renter was a journalist who'd been investigating corruption in the city planning department. What happened to the journalist? Disappeared 3 weeks ago. His editor contacted us when he missed a deadline for a major story he'd been working on. We found his car at the bottom of Miller's Pond, but no body. And you think it wasn't an accident? I think someone wanted to stop his investigation. The question is whether they succeeded. The storage unit had been rented under a false name, but the payment came from the journalist's personal bank account. When the rent stopped being paid, the facility prepared to auction it off. "We could use your help," Detective Reese said. "You have experience with this kind of thing." I said yes. Not because I want to get involved in another dangerous situation, but because I learned something important from that first storage unit. Some discoveries are too important to ignore, even when they put you at risk. The auction was on a Thursday morning. I arrived early and watched the other bidders, looking for anyone who seemed too interested in one particular unit. 2 men in expensive suits stood apart from the regular buyers, whispering to each other and checking their phones constantly. When Unit 23C came up for auction, they bid aggressively. The unit contained filing cabinets, computer equipment, and boxes of documents, exactly what you'd expect from a journalist's office. I bid against them, driving the price up to $300 before they backed off. They left immediately after I won the unit, which confirmed my suspicion that they weren't there to buy storage units. They were there to prevent someone else from buying this particular unit. I waited until they were gone before opening the unit. Inside, I found everything Detective Reese had expected. Investigative files on city planning corruption, financial records showing suspicious cash transactions, and photographs of secret meetings between developers and city officials. But I also found something else, a hidden compartment built into the bottom of one filing cabinet. Inside the compartment were 3 things: a USB drive, a handwritten note, and a key. The note was addressed to whoever finds this. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. My name is Carl Henderson, and I'm an investigative journalist for the Riverside Chronicle. For 6 months, I've been investigating corruption in the city planning department. What I discovered is bigger than just bribery. There's a systematic conspiracy to displace working-class residents and replace them with luxury developments. The conspiracy involves city officials, police officers, judges, and at least 3 major development companies. They've been using violence to eliminate opposition. I have evidence of 12 murders disguised as accidents over the past 2 years. The USB drive contains copies of all my evidence, including financial records, recorded conversations, and surveillance footage. The key opens a safety deposit box at Riverside Community Bank, box number 347. Inside that box is additional evidence, including the original recordings and documents. If something happens to me, please get this evidence to the FBI. Don't trust local police. At least 6 officers are taking payments from the developers. My editor, Janet Walsh, knows I was working on this story. She can help you understand what you found. Be careful. These people killed me to keep this secret. They won't hesitate to kill you too. I photographed the note and USB drive, then called Detective Reese immediately. We need to meet, I told her, and we need federal backup. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a federal building downtown, briefing FBI agents about Carl Henderson's evidence. The USB drive contained enough material to fill a small library. Thousands of emails, financial records spanning 5 years, and audio recordings of conversations that implicated dozens of people in the conspiracy. But the most damning evidence was a spreadsheet labeled Problem Resolution Log. It listed 43 people who had opposed development projects, along with dates and methods for their resolution. 12 entries were marked Permanent Resolution Complete. Those were the murders Carl Henderson had discovered. 15 entries were marked Permanent Resolution Pending. Those were people who were scheduled to be killed. The remaining entries were marked Standard Resolution or Financial Resolution. People who had been intimidated into selling or bribed into silence. Agent Morrison, who had handled the original Meridian case, reviewed the spreadsheet with growing anger. This is even bigger than Meridian, she told me. We're looking at a conspiracy that involves multiple companies, city government, and law enforcement. They've essentially turned Riverside into a testing ground for systematic displacement through violence. The safety deposit box contained the original recordings Carl Henderson had mentioned. He'd been wearing a hidden microphone during meetings with sources, capturing conversations that proved the conspiracy reached the highest levels of city government. In one recording, the mayor could be heard discussing which neighborhoods to target next for urban renewal. In another, the police chief explained how his officers could avoid investigating accidents that happened to community organizers. The most chilling recording was a conversation between Vincent Carver's replacement and a city council member. They discussed Carl Henderson by name, agreeing that he was becoming a problem that needed permanent resolution. He's too close to the truth, the council member said. We can't risk him publishing that story. Don't worry, the security contractor replied. I'll handle it the same way we handled Crenshaw. Based on this evidence, federal agents arrested 17 people in pre-dawn raids across Riverside. The charges included conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, violation of civil rights, and obstruction of justice. Carl Henderson's body was found 2 days later, weighted down at the bottom of Miller's Pond. The coroner determined he'd been tortured before he was killed, probably to reveal where he'd hidden his evidence. But Carl had been smart, just like Thomas Crenshaw. He'd prepared for the possibility of his own murder and hidden the evidence where it would eventually be found. His editor, Janet Walsh, published his final story posthumously. The exposé ran across 4 full pages of the Riverside Chronicle, detailing the conspiracy that had corrupted her city's government. Carl Henderson died defending the people of Riverside, she wrote in the introduction. His sacrifice ensured that the truth could not be buried with him. The story was picked up by national media and led to a federal investigation of similar conspiracies in other cities. So far, the FBI has identified development-related violence in 23 metropolitan areas. The Thomas Crenshaw Foundation has become the central clearinghouse for information about these conspiracies. We maintain the national database of suspicious incidents and provide investigative support to communities under attack. We've also started training journalists how to investigate development-related violence safely. Carl Henderson's death taught us that reporters are particularly vulnerable because they often work alone and their investigations are visible to their targets. Our journalist safety program includes secure communications, document protection, and personal security training. We've helped 12 reporters complete investigations of development conspiracies without being killed. But the most important thing we've learned is that these conspiracies are not isolated incidents. They represent a systematic attempt to reshape American cities by using violence to displace poor and working-class residents. The pattern is always the same. Identify valuable land occupied by people with limited political power, corrupt local officials to approve development plans, and eliminate opposition through intimidation or murder. Over the past 3 years, we've documented this pattern in major cities across the country. The conspiracies are funded by multinational corporations and implemented by networks of local contractors who specialize in violence. The Thomas Crenshaw Foundation is now investigating what we believe is a national conspiracy to use systematic violence for urban redevelopment. We've identified connections between development companies in different cities, shared contractors who move from one project to another, and coordination between corrupt officials across multiple jurisdictions. Our investigation has attracted the attention of Congress, and I've been invited to testify before the House Subcommittee on Urban Development next month. But it's also attracted the attention of the people we're investigating. The death threats have intensified, and we've had to relocate our offices twice after discovering surveillance equipment. Last week, someone tried to break into our database servers. The attempt was sophisticated. Whoever did it had detailed knowledge of our security systems and nearly succeeded in deleting 3 years of evidence. We've hired cybersecurity specialists and moved our most sensitive data to secure servers maintained by the FBI, but we know that our enemies are well-funded and determined. Despite the risks, we continue our work because we've learned something important. When corporations are willing to kill to achieve their goals, someone has to be willing to risk their life to stop them. Thomas Crenshaw and Carl Henderson died trying to protect people they'd never met. Their sacrifice saved dozens of lives and exposed conspiracies that would have killed hundreds more. The cycle continues. Somewhere out there, another investigator is gathering evidence against another conspiracy. Another Vincent Carver is making plans to silence them permanently. And maybe, if we're lucky, another storage unit holds the proof we need to stop them. That's the thing about secrets. They have a way of surfacing eventually. Sometimes in court documents, sometimes in police investigations, and sometimes in abandoned storage units bought by desperate people looking for treasure. I never found the treasure I was looking for when I started buying storage units. But I found something more valuable, the chance to matter. The chance to be the person who stops terrible things from happening to innocent people. Thomas Crenshaw died trying to protect strangers. Carl Henderson died trying to expose corruption. The least I can do is continue their work and make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain. After all, you never know what's hidden behind those metal doors until you cut off the lock and take a look inside. But be careful what you find. Some secrets are worth killing for, and some discoveries will change your life forever. That's the risk you take when you bid on other people's abandoned belongings. You might find treasure, you might find garbage, or you might find evidence of crimes that powerful people would do anything to keep hidden. In my case, I found all three. And given the choice, I'd do it all again. Because sometimes finding the right thing at the right time can save lives, and sometimes saving lives is worth risking your own. The Thomas Crenshaw Foundation continues to grow. We now have investigators in 12 cities and have prevented more than 100 murders disguised as accidents. We've helped families save their homes, exposed corruption in dozens of police departments, and sent 43 people to prison for conspiracy to commit murder. But our most important achievement is changing how people think about urban development. The old model, where corporations could use any means necessary to acquire property, is being replaced by laws that protect communities from violence and require genuine community engagement. Next month, I'm scheduled to testify before Congress about legislation that would create federal protections for community organizers and provide funding for investigations of development-related violence. The Thomas Crenshaw Community Protection Act would make it a federal crime to use violence or threats of violence to force people from their homes for commercial development. It would also create a national database of suspicious incidents and provide funding for community organizations to investigate harassment campaigns. Most importantly, it would honor the memory of a man who died trying to do the right thing. Thomas Crenshaw never met the people he was trying to protect. He didn't know Patricia Chen or Robert Wilson or any of the other residents who were targeted for elimination. He was just a private investigator who realized he'd been tricked into helping plan murders and decided to risk his life to stop them. His sacrifice saved dozens of lives and inspired a movement that has protected thousands more. That's the power of one person deciding to do the right thing, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs them everything. That's what I learned from Storage Unit 47B. Sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that force you to choose between your safety and your conscience. Thomas Crenshaw made his choice. Carl Henderson made his choice. Now it's your turn. What will you do when you find evidence of crimes that powerful people want to keep hidden? Will you walk away and pretend you never saw it? Or will you risk everything to make sure the truth comes to light? The choice is yours. But remember, somewhere out there, people are counting on you to make the right one, even if they never know your name. Just like I was counting on Thomas Crenshaw to make the right choice when he discovered what Vincent Carver was really planning. And just like Patricia Chen was counting on me to make the right choice when I found those photographs in Storage Unit 47B. The cycle continues. The next discovery is waiting behind the next locked door. What will you find when you cut off the lock and look inside?